we were talking about some poor chap spending a fortune explaining how he had played with himself, and the way that Scientology, in the countercult world, it's usually called guilt induction, that you make people feel guilty. I mean, Saint Jerome added this element to Christianity in about the 4th century, I'm told, where people can become absolutely obsessed about their sex lives. So did you want to talk about the staff application form? You mentioned that when we were talking.
I feel that Scientology is unduly interested in every detail of your sex life. And before I explain that more, why is that, John? What is your viewpoint on why you need to know every detail of every partner you've ever had, what you did, for how long, what did you use, what was involved, what were your mental image pictures at the time of orgasm, on and on and on. Why did they do that, John?
Well,
does Scientology have this interest in your sex life?
On the first, in the first count, it's because of the guilt. I've talked with a fair number of former members over the years who have said that they've got horror stories that they'd like to tell, but they're afraid that somebody will tell their children what they got up to when they were younger. So the blackmail material is quite is very strong, that you can get people to feel afraid of criticizing you later in case you reveal their secrets. Now, I frankly didn't care. And, but then when I left, I didn't have any children, so I wasn't thinking about that. But yeah, the reality is that our culture is very obsessed with sex. Western European culture, European-based culture, is obsessed with sex in a way that is not true everywhere around the world. Some cultures are. I think the Indian culture is fairly obsessed with sex. I think many African cultures aren't. But it's a way of making people feel inferior and sinful and dependent. And of course, it's a rich seam to work, because unless somebody is born without any sexual urges, and that is very rare, then there will be something they've done. And so you can make them feel guilty, and you can then exploit them. And as you say, the Hubbard's nonsense suggesting that we're all basically good, it's just, it'll run to as much money as you have to pay, you will be paying to talk largely about what you've done sexually. And who hasn't done something or other, especially within the idea that masturbation is an evil act. I imagine if you got somebody to list every time they'd masturbated, that you might be sat with the e-meter for a few months there.
Whoa, your hard-earned money so that Scientology can have this. I don't know if your audience know that every single counseling session, you're on video.
You are now,
There's
yeah.
one video pointed at you, one video pointed at the meter, and all of this is not only handwritten abbreviation of what you're saying, but also recorded. I get a lot of calls. Some people are on the fence. And what I told this guy, look, you're lonely, you're feeling all undecided. Just come on over to my forum, Outer Banks, and you'll meet tons of people who crossed over and are leading happy lives, fruitful lives, prosperous lives. And he said, can't. They've got so much dirt on me. I confessed to this, that I just can't. So I realized, boy, that is a real holder, right? I said, well, what kind of dirt? He said, oh, just, sexual things. I mean, it wasn't like he was some kind of serial killer. It was just that he felt he could not have the world know his sexual secrets. So it is a kind of, a blackmail. Masturbation is truly mocked. Now, they take it a step further. At Gold Base, believe it or not, they would read out masturbation confessions to the whole crew. I had a delightful Danish girl called Camilla who did a lot of videos. Now, what I'm telling you, she herself, this is not her, it's on video. She told me all this on my YouTube channel on video. It's not like I'm giving out secret stuff. And her husband was sitting there in the audience, 300 people, and they read out her masturbation confession to the crew to shame her. And her husband, after that particular meeting, said, "Camilla, you disgust me. I'm filing for divorce papers tomorrow." And he divorced her. She was a messenger, actually. So can you imagine? You thought it was priest penitent privilege? You thought your auditing was just cathartic because you would give off secrets to an auditor on staff. And this was standard at the Gold Base. They did it over and over and over to humiliate and shame a masturbation. It was read out to the crew. What do you make of that, John?
Well, it's seriously unethical, and really a very destructive thing to do, isn't it? That confidence, called a fiduciary duty in law, that really, we've heard of Catholic priests who would go to prison rather than saying what had been confessed to them. And, a virtuous person would never repeat such a thing. So to use these things, and the point is that, he who is without sin
cast the first
stone. And in this case, maybe it is true that the senior members of Scientology, like David Miscavige, don't actually have genitals. So maybe they don't masturbate and maybe they've never had sex. But why on earth they'd feel that there was something seriously wrong with sex? I'm actually reading the philosopher Bertrand Russell's book, The Conquest of Happiness. And one of the first things that he says, if you want to be happy, is you have to deal with this notion of sin, and you have to get a realistic idea of what is and isn't damaging to do. And he says, and sex is, and this is, he's writing in 1930, sex will be top of the list, that you've been taught how shameful it is to be naked, and how shameful it is to have a body and all of this sort of stuff. And of course, that really is a way of making people miserable and unhappy, that, like it or not, sexual pleasure is the most extreme pleasure that human beings have. And that's that. If you're doing it properly, obviously. Not doing it properly, it might be a bit unpleasant, but it's an incredible form of joy. And to make of it this dirty, mucky sort of thing, I imagine that David Miscavige has possibly masturbated, once, before realizing how sinful it was. So it's manipulative, abusive, coercive, and despicable, frankly.
And then you dare not, like, somebody can't speak up and say, look, reading out people's private masturbation confessions is really not a good thing. You dare not. That's treasonous. You cannot. There's no tolerance for questioning or any kind of critical thought on anything that David Miscavige started this masturbation confessional meetings.
Yeah.
That wasn't around with Hubbard. This is a David Miscavige invention. And this was weekly, by the way, weekly. It wasn't just one shot on Camilla. It was it was a kind of, you dare not criticize. This is why we keep calling cult. You dare not question authority.
I mean, forgive me. What do? They call it wanker of the week, or it's
wanker of the week. Well, they make the person come up on stage. So he has to look at the 300, 400 Sea Org members bundled together. And they say, all right, Camilla, we're going to read out your confession to the group. And she's standing there looking at the group. Her husband, in this particular story, she told all this on YouTube. She's looking at her husband there, who just, how embarrassing for the husband. Be in an audience where his wife is on stage and her masturbation confession is read to the group. See, these are inside little stories of the culture within. You and Steve Hassan and other great writers, and you have a great overview, but the day-to-day life within is just beyond belief. That's the good phrase I want to use. It's beyond belief.
Yeah, and that nobody in those 300 or 400 people, that nobody in that room was ethical enough to stand up and say, this is wrong.
Yeah.
You know, they've been cowed into this position.
Yes.
When Hubbard talks about, the suppressive person being surrounded by cowed and ill associates, well, David Miscavige is surrounded by cowed and ill associates. He's also, he's boasted about being ruthless, which was, I've said often, that was one of the reasons I left Scientology in 1983, because he talked about being tough and ruthless. And I didn't want to be involved with any organization that was ruthless. I believe that having mercy, being able to forgive and, get on with things, it's the only way that we can survive as the human race. If we're all going to be petty little martinets picking on one another for our faults, well, there are no saints. There are no people who are without sin. Was it Saint Augustine who prayed, Lord, make me chaste, but not yet? So,
I suddenly remembered, good point, John. I suddenly remembered a little anecdote when I said, you dare not say, hold your horses. This may not be a good path to go down. We're crossing the line here on what she gave up in a confessional, and it's being broadcast. David Miscavige had a meeting with Tech and Qual. Tech division is everybody that delivers counsel, and there's whole teams involved in that. And qualifications is the cramming and the correction area.
Yeah.
So there were about 180 people at the Sandcastle. And this was on the eve of golden age of tech, which was Miscavige's revisions of Hubbard's messed up technology that only he could correct.
Which was back in about 2007, somewhere about there.
I'm a little fuzzy on the dates. I'm a little fuzzy. It's 2005, I would contest, but it's somewhere.
Well, anyway, Mike Grinder was assigned to, re-edit a book in about 36 hours or something, which Miscavige eventually took 2 years to do himself.
Yeah. On no sleep. And there was a guy from Europe. Europe recruits a lot of people that come on fake visas of religiosity. And he had a kind of permanent smile on his face. It was either nerves or it was just, he wasn't grinning at you. He just had it looked like he was smiling. And David Miscavige was making some big point, and his eyes came on this European guy with the smile on his face. And in Scientology, you have something called demo kits. A demo kit is a bunch of pebbles and shells and rick-a-rack.
Demonstrate.
That you use to demonstrate. David Miscavige picked up a pebble and hurled it at the guy in a temper tantrum for what he thought was grinning or mocking or finding it funny that David Miscavige was announcing some new tech. The guy ducked, but he could have been blinded if he hadn't had a very quick reaction. That pebble that David Miscavige hurled could have blinded him. John, do you think one person in that room, 180 people, even thought of reporting the assault to Clearwater PD? This is, you can't take a rock and throw a rock at someone almost blind. You can't, I mean, the rock did arrive on someone, but not hurting their eye. You can't, in a normal, if you worked for Coca-Cola or, you know, Victoria's Secret or some company, and the boss took her, hurled a solid implement, Marks and Spencer's, to be British. If you worked for Marks and Spencer's and you were in her, and you hurled a rock, that could have been a police report. That's an assault, attempted assault. You can't be violent like that.
No, and David Miscavige has a remarkable history of violence towards people. The amount of people, you know, from the Mission Holders Conference in 1982, when he was, I had an email from a guy who he smashed up against a filing cabinet, right, you know, and that's 39 years ago. So he's just, it's a terrible situation. And I mean, you sent me a list of bullet points, which we'll doubtless discuss one day, because as ever, we're just rambling. But the first one that you put was absolute adherence and belief in a guru, in a father figure, a guru, the Indian word for it. A cult has a charismatic leader that becomes an object of worship. And here's a point where I will disagree. I don't think that Ron Hubbard was charismatic, and I don't think that David Miscavige is charismatic. The sociologist Weber said that charisma is something that exists between people. It's not something somebody has. It's something that you acknowledge somebody. I'm not sure that's true. I think there are people who are genuinely charismatic. There are people you walk into a room and you feel good. You know, they have a certain power. Some actors have that ability. Some musicians have that ability. I've never had that feeling about Ron Hubbard. I didn't meet him, but he didn't seem to me to be a charismatic person. David Miscavige, far less so. So there's something about granting authority to somebody and saying, oh, this person knows, this person has these abilities. We have to bow down in front of this person, which to me is something we should never feel. We should always be able to question an authority. We should always be able to say, why do you believe that? Why do you teach that? Rather than going, you must know better than I do. It's just not a safe position. It becomes authoritarianism. And, you know, for me, that is the destructive force in human culture, where we allow people to bully us, to boss us around, where we don't stand up to that. We end up under dictators, you know, monarchs, presidents, call them what you will, but people who have too much power and who are allowed to do things based upon their caprice, you know, like Henry VIII, he felt like chopping off his wife's head, so he got to do that. He felt like divorcing another one, so he got to do it. Everybody should be under the rule of law. And when David Miscavige decided to play David and Goliath, I'm presuming that this man was bigger than David Miscavige, because most people are. When he decided to play David and Goliath, he should have, as you say, been reported to the authorities. At least somebody in the room should have had the courage. You know, these are supposed to be people who've done all this supernatural training and achieved all of these abilities. Scientologists are the most ethical people in the world, according to Ron Hubbard. No, it was a room full of cowards. And that's sadly the way it is. And I speak as somebody who did stand up, who did say no, and got my just desserts for doing that, for 16 years of harassment in response. But it wasn't because of anything that had been done to me. It was, I had no axe to grind with Scientology. I was just profoundly concerned when I realized how people's lives were being ripped apart, in the Sea Organization particularly, how people were being pushed into debt, spending all of their assets, giving everything to Scientology, how families were being torn apart, and the physical damage, people who actually died. Chris Shelton recently, in an interview, when he was asked about the suicide rate in Scientology, said that he didn't believe that it was above the normal rate. Well, when I researched it in 1993 for FactNet, when I was the president at FactNet, which was the first database of coercive psychology on the internet, I reckon that the suicide rate was at least 10 times higher than what is normal. So, Scientology can have tremendously deleterious effects. If you are becoming self-determined, then you must have the cojones to stand up and say, this is wrong, stop it. And seeing all of the poor people, including your former husband, Heber Jentzsch, being herded into the hole, this double trailer, and held there for years in captivity. What had they achieved? What had Scientology given them? They were just sheeple, just following this malevolent man who this terrible, seething bully who exhibits nothing of the grace of a Buddha, nothing of the saintliness that we look for in religious leaders. He's just, well, actually, I'm at a loss for words. Fill in a superlatively negative word here, and that's what David Miscavige is. He's a dreadful human being.
Monster.
A monster. That will do. Yeah.
Well, even talking about St. Hill and the Lake, Heber, Guillaume, Executive Director, International.
Yeah.
Every day they were ordered to walk on the lawn of St. Hill Green and hurl themselves into a lake in November, where the water would be really cold. We're talking United Kingdom.
Yeah, we're talking very close to freezing point in November here.
Yeah, and this was a daily routine. They had some guy, Bob, someone who was the PR. He was a David Miscavige favorite, and he would order that. This was their punishment every day, to hurl themselves into the pool. This came from mimicking Hubbard hurling the Class 8 auditors overboard for making an error.
In Corfu in 1968.
Yeah, to hurl people overboard, to drop 4 stories into the ocean. So you see, Hubbard started that tradition.
Well,
and then
I'm actually going to issue a point of correction there. I said that I wasn't that keen on Mary Sue Hubbard. Mary Sue Hubbard started overboarding when on the Avon River, and Otto Rose was keel hauled, roped and dragged under the hull of the ship. And because Otto was himself a former merchant sailor, and because he'd studied judo, he knew that there was a metal rubbing strake running around the boat, and that if he had gone head first onto it, would have cracked his skull open. And so he managed to bounce himself off, and thankfully he did not drown. So overboarding came in after that and was a slightly lesser form of evil. Though, as you say, people were being thrown in, people who couldn't swim, often tied at the ankles, sometimes blindfolded, from a much greater height than the high diving board at the swimming pool. I first interviewed, it was Neville Chamberlain who I first interviewed about overboarding, because when I belonged to Scientology, I'd never heard of overboarding. What? And after I left and heard about it, I asked Nev about it, and Nev said, oh, yeah, it used to happen. And the next time I asked him, I got him at a more vulnerable moment. And I said, well, what was it really like? And his face fell and he said, it was terrifying. It was terrifying. We'd all be standing there taking our watches off, waiting to see which one of us had been 2 minutes late, or had made a flub in an auditing session and was going to be thrown overboard. Here was Hubbard seeking to break people. Yeah. And I was really surprised. It's the auditor number 41, magazine of Scientology, where there's a double-page spread of pictures where you see Barem Berez and somebody else throwing somebody overboard in a vertical position, being thrown overboard. And at the bottom, it says, picture credit, L. Ron Hubbard.
Jeez.
So he not only ordered it, he admitted it.
Do you have that, Auditor 41? Do you have
that?
Yeah,
I think it's probably online, hopefully by now, but yeah.
Oh, there is, okay, that must be, I'll have Spike, I've got that picture. I'll have Spike post the picture of this. You know, I'd like to sort of wind down and wrap up, but I want to tell you an important story of David Miscavige's monster domineering violence, because you mentioned the history of violence. There's a history. Yeah. I was a young intern at St. Hill in the early 70s, and I lived with Anne Gregg, LRH librarian, who lived at 6 St. Hill Green. Her house was 7 St. Hill Green. And Malin Gelfen was the intern supervisor. We were all interns learning to counsel. And Malin announced that there had been an incident, and I don't know how she covered it, but she more or less said David Miscavige had punched his PC in session. He was a 12-year-old.
Yeah.
And he was considered this prodigy. In fact, they had a magazine called An Afternoon at St. Hill. And this was supposed to be a monthly magazine. And David Miscavige was going to be featured as this wonder, a 12-year-old, and he can counsel. Yeah. And the camera crew were following him around. Well, he lost his cool in this session. And I have a live report of someone who was there. He came out, it's also in the book Going Clear, but he came, a woman came out of session from him, hunched over, holding her stomach, hysterically crying. Now, Malin knew that this could be fodder for gossip. I mean, St. Hill was the pinnacle of there was no flag, there was no free winds. If you wanted to go to the top of the bridge, you came to England to St. Hill. So this was supposed to be the ideal. You don't have incidents of violence and punching a PC. So Malin said, now I'm giving you an instruction. This is to be buried. Nobody is going to keep talking about it and gossiping about it. We're burying it. It's a very unfortunate incident. And the Miscaviges went back to Philadelphia in 48. I think David was kicked out of the campus. I think it was horrifying and electrifying to the execs that this had happened. And Miscavige didn't have all the glory of being, you know, captain of the Sea Org and all these ridiculous titles. He was just a public. And the camera crew that followed him around, they all folded, and that was the end of An Afternoon at St. They had one publication, and that was the end of that. That folded it. The camera crew went away. David Miscavige, of course, wasn't featured. He was a thug. So at 12 years old, he had the urge to punch. That urge traveled with him and floated through time and space, because as soon as he became a messenger, he did the same thing. He punched, he hit, he struck, he was violent, he was out of control. But I'm telling you this St. Hill story because I had dinner with Marty Rathburn back in the day when we were friends. And I told Marty
when he had friends.
When he had friends. So we were having a dinner at a very nice 5-star restaurant, and I told him this story. And I said, Marty, I could post it on your blog, but people would say, she has an axe to grind. And anyway, a week later, someone from Australia told the whole story on the blog. A lot of Australians were at St. Hill. Scientology was banned in Australia. It was considered evil and sinister and not a religion. And so all the 100 Australian families, including Janice the Gillums, 100 families migrated. So it was full of Australians. And an Australian who was there at the time of the Miscavige punching wrote up this, virtually what I've just told you. It's on Marty's blog. And I said, Marty. So then I went in under that posting and I said, I was there. I was there. I didn't eyewitness it, but I witnessed the girl hunched over, just sobbing on her way, like coming out of the auditing room, and then David Miscavige followed. He eyewitnessed the aftermath of this punching incident.
Which would have been about 1973?
72, 70. Yes, you're very, very accurate. 72, 70. So now I felt that I could tell a story because an independent Australian was right, and they started the story. It wasn't, oh, Karen hates David Miscavige, so she's mocking it. So, no, this was told. And then another couple of others who were there at St. Hill said, oh, I was the HCO area sec. I know all about the. So independently from me telling the story were other sources who were there at the time. Scientology, and it appeared in the book called Going Clear, this anecdote. Because it's showing how at 12 years old, Miscavige was ready to use violence. He never got rid of this trait and escalated it in later years.
Well, I mean, in 1984, when I was the supreme pontiff of the UK independence, the chairman of the OT Committee UK, which consisted entirely of me, I called together a committee of evidence and invited David Miscavige to appear, which he failed to do, but rather than just finding him guilty in absentia, that committee met. The committee was headed by Vince Barnes, who had been a member of the Watchdog Committee, one of the 14 people answerable directly to Hubbard and senior to David Miscavige. So Vince had done the flag executive briefing course after doing the organization executive course and all of this stuff. And so he seemed the right person to put in charge of the committee. And they went through the Bill of Particulars, which was properly filed. We did things according to the book. And in June of 1984, I personally, on goldenrod paper, declared David Miscavige suppressive. And looking at the details there are a number of, so we're talking about something that long ago, 37 years ago, that it was already very clear and very apparent. I was told that the staff, because we sent it to all of the orgs and missions, I was told that the staff at Chicago cheered when they received Isn't it dreadful? And it's so often the case that a dictatorial and authoritarian group, a totalitarian group, which has total authority over its members, will, go towards evil. I mean, I'm reading a book called Strong Men by Ruth Ben-Ghiat, and she's an expert on Italian history and on authoritarianism, and reading the descriptions of Colonel Gaddafi or Mussolini, on whom she's an expert, the idea that people were willing to follow. I mean, Mussolini would rape anywhere up to 4 women a day, brutally, in a 10-minute session. Gaddafi actually kept women in dungeons, sometimes for years, so he could rape them. And the idea that such people, we have to go with our good friend Ira Chalef and his incredible work on courageous followership, where people learn how to treat leaders so that leaders do not become brutal. And Miscavige exemplifies the totalitarian dictator, and people should not be following him. They should not be doing this. But
one of my biggest upsets with Hubbard was how he could have allegedly turned it over to Miscavige. Now, there's a lot of Mike Rinder completely dispute, like, at any rate, even if he didn't leave it to Miscavige, a monster, he died off without seeing that Scientology was, if this was his life's work, he did a self-destruct to make sure that it then got into its own self-destruct.
I think that, again, Going Clear by Lawrence Wright has an account from Sarge Fouth, who was with Hubbard at the end, when Hubbard basically, not for the first time, was saying, I've achieved nothing, it's a complete failure, it doesn't work, kill me, find some way of killing me. From the accounts that I've seen, I would say that somewhere around about 1983, Hubbard's alcoholism, his possible drug use at that time, but certainly his alcoholism, and his dementia were taking over, and the whole collapse of Scientology. There's a point where Jesse Prince at Toronto in the Getting Clear seminar was saying that he was in East Grinstead, we were publishing our completions, and I think there were 7 people working, 7 total in the 2-3 little groups in East Grinstead. He was saying the completions in terms of training and counselling were higher from those 7 people than from the 180 people working at St. Hill. That the whole thing by then it just completely was devouring itself. But was there ever a point, looking right back to the beginning, when I corresponded with Don Rogers, who's he wrote an appendix to Dianetics, the Mental Science of Modern Health, which was published well into the 1980s. So he was that closely involved with Hubbard. And when I corresponded with him, and he'd left in 1954 with no upset with Hubbard at all. He liked Hubbard, He was on the board of every foundation from 1950 to 1950, and there are a fair few of them over those years. And he left because he felt his case was resolved. By 1984, he'd changed his mind about that, and I was in touch with him. But the stories he told me about Hubbard, with no axe to grind, no skin in the game, he thought that the technology was a good thing. But he nonetheless told me stories that alarmed me tremendously. For example, when they opened the doors to the first foundation in Elizabeth, New Jersey in April 1950, just before the book was published, book 1 was published, and Hubbard turned to him before opening the door and said, let's sell these people a piece of blue sky. So the intention, Hubbard talks about intention, counter-intention, other intention. Hubbard always had another intention for Scientology. We were being used. We were pawns in a game. As he said in 1952 in the Philadelphia doctorate course, you have a game, you have pieces, and they must not know what the rules are. So they stay pieces. You have a player who has to conceal the rules from the pieces. And then you have the game maker who does not have to follow the rules. And he didn't. And we were the game. We were, at worst, a kind of magical ceremony that he was using to make himself immortal, to smash his name into history, as he said in a 1938 letter to his first wife. That my only intention is to smash my name into history. And he did not believe in immortality outside of artistic production or ideas. He had no belief in spiritual immortality. And you kind of go, that's a bit strange, given what he did. So the whole thing was a fabrication, a deception, a way of tricking people. What astonishes me is that it was so successful, that the amount of intelligent, resourceful people that I've met, people who've managed to make a good living in the real world after Scientology, not mentioning any names, people who've managed to achieve things artistically and creatively. And we were lured into this and we believed, we swallowed it whole. It's really quite a thought to have created something that elaborate. And there's nothing else like it, having studied literally hundreds of groups now over the years. There's nothing like Scientology in all of history, where one individual has come forward, created this morass of conflicting information, which is largely based on the idea that, we existed in other planets in dull bodies and went around fighting each other all the time, having glare fights and things like this. That when you step back from it, you kind of go, oh, I'm a bit embarrassed that I believe such childish nonsense, but that's the reality of it. And here we are at the end of another wonderful conversation. We'd probably better go and do something else with our time now.
It's good to look at some facts and some truths and unveil the rah-rah and the deception and the fake.
Truth really blows the lies away, as Ron Hubbard said.
Nice. John?
Yeah.
Big hug to you.
Likewise. I
absolutely enjoy hanging with you. Looking forward to our next visit.
Yeah, be good.
Bye everybody. Hope you learned a thing or two.
Yep.
And we'll see you again. Take care. Bye.
We will. Thanks so much, Karen, and thanks to everybody. I'm John Atack. Bye.
Hi, John here. Thanks for watching. We'd appreciate it very much if you would click like, as well as subscribe, and click the bell for notifications. Every dollar helps, and we welcome new patrons on Patreon, or you can make a one-off payment with any currency through PayPal. Thanks so much.